So the first area I want to talk about is the general frame of these cases. When I first uh, decided to focus on commercial motor vehicle cases, I ran an ad in our local trial lawyer newspaper for the better part of 3 years that said truck cases are different than car cases. And there was a little box that changed every week. And in that box, I put something that was different about trucking cases than car wreck cases. That was my idea of marketing at the time, but it was also my way of trying to present to the world something that I believe to this very day is the central thing that has to be appreciated and carried forward through these cases in order to make them, frankly, as big as you want them to be at the end when you get a result in the case. And that's that the cases are truly different. That's not just marketing, that's a reality. It's the reason, understanding that, and not only understanding that, but thinking about how you can continue to present that time and time again through your case is mission critical, because we are a lot of times in these cases asking people to treat the truck driver differently than they would treat me or you as we drive our cars or SUVs or pickup trucks down the road. We're going to say find liability against them, but don't hold us comparatively responsible for sometimes doing the exact same thing. How can we do that if the same rules essentially apply to both parties? You can't, is the short answer. So we have to continue to present over and over again in as many ways as we can that these cases are different. So how are they different? So that's why it's important to do it. So how are they different? Well, they're different in lots of ways. And we can start at the very, very beginning and say, well, look at a truck versus look at a car, SUV, motorcycle. And obviously you've got different sizes, you've got different masses, you've got different heights, you've got different bumper heights, you've got different lighting, you've got, a tractor trailer truck at least is meant to bend. It's an articulating vehicle. Most of our cars aren't. It takes a lot longer to do something in a truck. It takes a lot more space to do something in a truck. All of us have to clear an intersection, to make a left turn, to change lanes. All of those things, it seems obvious to say, well, those things are all different. But what I'm hoping to show you through these next couple of weeks of time is that it goes way, 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 way beyond that. First of all, that, by the way, is the justification. Because they drive differently is the justification for why we need different licensure for somebody who drives a truck. It's the justification for why the rules are going to be different, for why it's going to be the justification to explain to the world why what is reasonable, if our standards around the country is reasonable conduct, and that standard really doesn't change. It's not really true in most states to say that the standard of care for a truck driver is higher than the standard of care for the car driver. It's both reasonable conduct. But what it means to be reasonable when you're driving an 80,000-pound tractor trailer, where your line of sight is 13 feet off the ground, is different than what it takes to be reasonable when you're driving a moped. I mean, it's totally different, or a car, an SUV, or any of the vehicles that we typically drive. So we're going to, and a lot of people talk about explaining the why. Well, we're building in the why. But what you're going to learn as we go through these next few weeks is that not only is it different in size, but there's actually different laws that apply. There's different regulations that apply, both when you have a federal a case moving in interstate commerce, so something that the federal motor carrier rules apply to, but even in your perfectly, traditionally in-state cases, where, each state has its own regulations that govern intra-state trucking. A lot of it's borrowed, you'll learn, from the federal side, but the rules are different. And here's the problem. The problem is you don't know what those differences are unless you've studied them. And guess what else? Neither does the judge, neither the police, neither do witnesses, neither does anybody else, and neither do these people called jurors who are going to decide your case. A lot of times, neither do adjusters, neither do, so we have to assume the posture, And I remember the first time this struck me was listening to Rick Friedman talk many years ago about the idea of the trial lawyer as teacher. And you know, he's so naturally a teacher if you ever watch his work. So the idea of us, instead of getting angry when people don't apply the right rules, to assume the position of teacher and to use every one of these opportunities as an opportunity to teach, that's the way I think we should do this. We'll talk about that, especially in week 3, when we're confronting people who are hostile to our case, because at first blush they're applying the wrong damn standards to our cases, and we see it all the time. I see it all the time, and I know Jay does too. Anybody who does this sees it. You know, and you know, it's not popular, especially today, to say I'm a former police officer. I spent 6 years in law enforcement, but I can tell you over a 6-year career in law enforcement, including working fatality accidents, lots of wrecks on the road, I never received 1 minute of training, let alone 1 hour of training on what truck drivers are supposed to do that's different than drivers of cars. And I know I'm not alone in that. I think it's a big hole in the system. So when we focus on the differences, we focus on different laws, all the differences about the vehicles, the differences in training requirements, the differences in licensure requirements, ultimately the differences in not the standard of care, but in how the standard of care is applied to drivers. Also, when you think about these cases, the insurance rules are different. We're going to talk a little bit about that later today. And there's bigger money at stake because even the minimums are higher. So insurance companies tend to defend these cases much more aggressively. And so how do we react to that? How do we respond to that? That's where we're going to talk about intake and investigation today. But I will tell you that I have literally copies of contracts between insurers and law firms who have signed on to work for insurers in trucking cases, where the law firms promise, as part of the terms and conditions of the contract, that they will have an immediate response team available within 1 hour of the time that they're called, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they will have somebody on the scene within 2 hours. And in one of those contracts says they'll have an attorney on the scene within 2 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so think of the aggressiveness that they're bringing to the table to defend themselves. Do you think they're out there trying to get to the truth, or do you think that they're out there trying to protect their interests? I'll leave that for you to decide. There's a short answer to it. And so at the end of the day, we need to be just as reactive in these cases, and we'll talk about that. There's also different players that potentially have responsibility and different ways to look for coverage in these cases, and we'll talk about all that later today. So the first point that I want to make to you guys is not just the marketing claim that these cases are different, but they truly are different in many ways. And that part of what I'm going to ask you to do, and sort of asterisk on your page, is look for opportunities to show how different it is. Let me give you one quick example before we move on. When I depose a truck driver, sometimes I'll ask a truck driver about having to do a pre-trip inspection, even in a case where there's not really an issue of maintenance in the case. Why do I do that? Because what I'll say to the driver is something like, you know, Mr. or Miss Driver, when I go to work every day, I eat my breakfast, I do whatever I need to do in the morning, I grab my keys, I go into my garage, I push a button, I get in the car, I back out, and I drive to work. That's what I do. You don't really get to do that, do you? And now what am I doing? I'm putting them on an island. You have to look at your brake system to make sure your brakes are in alignment. You need to look at and test the air pressure in your hoses before you leave. You need to walk the entire circumference of your truck and check every light, and check every piece of tape, and check every connector, and check everything before you ever can even get in your truck to leave. You see what I'm doing? I'm showing that they're different than we are. And you can do that throughout the case by looking for opportunities and highlighting it. You don't have to take a lot of time to do it. but you can do it, and it shows they're different than we are. And look, I mean, the fact that they have to go and look around their vehicle as carefully as they're supposed to, when later you have a case that involves something that should have been caught on that pre-trip, if you didn't explain all that beforehand, and somebody applied for themselves what they do when they get out to leave at home in the morning, they'd say, well, you know what, I probably wouldn't have noticed a cut on my tire before I left in the morning. Big deal, so the guy didn't notice it. Well, it's a big deal if part of their job is to do and sign off on doing, a pre-trip inspection. So looking for ways to differentiate. You're also going to look for ways to differentiate trucking companies from the businesses that we all have interactions with on a day-to-day basis. Because as a general rule, your law firm and other professional firms, your typical stores, your typical companies out there, they're not employing commercial drivers, and they've not sworn to the United States government by virtue of getting licensure to operate commercial motor vehicles that they're going to follow a different set of rules. And you're going to learn about those rules a little bit today and a little bit next week. So we differentiate the driver and we differentiate the company, because the company is literally promised. The only thing we make a company do, they don't even have to go get a CDL license. They don't have to get a special license. All they got to do is sign something that says, we promise. We promise we're going to abide by the following rules. And then we trust that they're going to do that. And so you can see that how just focusing on that can lead you to trial stories, trial themes about the betrayal of trust in those types of situations.
Joe, let me ask you.
Yeah,
This pre-trial checklist, is there an actual physical list that the driver's supposed to check off like an airplane pilot, or I'm just wondering, or is it just in his head?
Yeah, no, they're taught a very specific way to go about doing it. It's a multi-stage process. Most of them use a checklist to do it, and they check it all off. It is like a pilot's list, Dan, so the answer is it's very similar. There's some rule changes that have happened about how that needs to happen. I'm not going to get into the weeds on it right now, but yes, they're required to do it. They're required to follow a very specialized process, and they actually even have to take a special test as part of their CDL test, just on the inspection. It's a physical test. It's not just on paper. They have to get out there with an inspector who watches them do a full pre-trip inspection and signs off that they know how to do it.
Joe?
Yep.
Ronald Jericho had a question about, and maybe you just hit on it, but the obligations you're talking about and what Dan just asked you about, are these set forth by the CDL, or are they just company requirements? And I know you'll get into it later, but some of the stuff you're talking about, where's it come from? Why does the driver have to do it?
Well, it for two reasons. One is it's in the regulations themselves, both the federal regulations and every state adopts at least the majority of those same regulations into their own state scheme for regulating trucking companies and truck drivers for intrastate commerce. So number one, it's the rules. Number two, it's the industry standards as developed and tested through that. It sort of grow out of the actual regulations. So there's testing required. There's actually pre-trip, post-trip, and mid-trip inspections that are supposed to be being done. The mid-trip ones are really more designed to look at your load and look at your load securement to make sure that nothing is loosened up, over time, because that can happen and it can be catastrophic when it does. So, step one here is to just keep in mind, at every stage that we go through, we're going to look for ways to distinguish. We're going to look for ways to differentiate. And we're going to look for ways to teach other people, the police officers, the judges, the jurors, step one, different. That justifies and explains the why behind everything else that we're going to be doing in the case. So it really is, I know I'm putting exclamation points and underlining this point because I think it's mission critical. And it's so often forgotten and thought of as an afterthought, in these cases. So it's the differentiation of both the driver and also later the company and why why does your law firm probably doesn't have a driving training for its people who drive even on behalf of the firm, do they? Your typical mom and pop store probably doesn't have policies and procedures about how they drive their vehicles. Many businesses don't, or if they do, it's things like don't drive intoxicated, don't drive with your cell phone, very basic things. Trucking companies are very different than that because their obligations are different. So that's the point. So if it's okay, Jay, do you have something else?
Yeah, Kenny Adair followed up on this, and so you talk about the obligation the driver has, right? About the pre-trip, for example. Are there any consequences to the carrier that the carriers have to the government or FMCSA for not, complying with the regs for the stuff you?
Well, leave it to Kenny to bust my chops right here at the very beginning. But thanks, Kenny, for the question. Actually, it's a great question. The way the regs are set up, almost in every place where there is a duty put on the driver, there's a concomitant duty put on the motor carrier to ensure that the driver complies. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, the motor carrier has responsibility for the truck, the load, and the driver that's being moved under their DOT number. And so there are consequences both directly because they have direct responsibility under regulations, and there's vicarious responsibility as well because they're liable for the driver's conduct. And by the way, inherent in your question might be that there's a huge misunderstanding that a lot of people don't know. In trucking, there's really not an effective defense based on independent contractor for things like what we're talking about, because the regulations literally define the employer-employee relationship differently than the IRS does. And the reason behind that is to make sure that there's not a truck, a load, a driver on the road that doesn't fall under somebody's DOT authority, because the government wants to be able to regulate somebody at the motor carrier level. And we'll get a lot more into that next week, but that's the answer to the question. So what I'd like to do is move on now to point number 2. And point number 2, I think there's about 500 people or so on this call right now. And I guarantee you point number 2 will make you money today, because my bet is of the 494 people on this call, somebody, probably more than one, probably more than 10 or 20, have cases in your office right now that technically are trucking cases that you're not treating as trucking cases. Because here's how it works. When we think of trucking cases, we think of the big giant big rig. We think of the 18-wheeler cab hauling a big huge trailer. And we know when we have a case that involves one of those vehicles, we're dealing with a tractor trailer truck, and it's a trucking case. We sometimes even have the idea that if we're dealing with one of those big box trucks, maybe that looks like the Home Depot big truck or the Lowe's big truck, those big delivery trucks, that we're dealing with a commercial motor vehicle, and maybe that's a trucking case. But here's the way the rules are written. There's actually 2 definitions of a commercial motor vehicle. One is found under the CDL rules, and one is found under the general rules. The one that's found under the CDL rules defines a commercial motor vehicle for which you need a CDL license to operate. So that's a class of vehicles. That includes the big giant 18-wheeler that we're talking about. That includes 26,001 pound vehicles and above, big, huge vehicles out there. But the other place where you find the definition is in the general area. And in that general area, it basically says that any vehicle or combination of vehicles that exceeds 10,001 pounds and is being used for a commercial purpose constitutes a commercial motor vehicle. And so the differences are, for that kind of a vehicle, we're talking about, if you look around your community, we're talking about first large individual vehicles like that Lowe's truck that I talked about, or like a plumbing contractor's truck, or like a big, huge construction company's F-350 dually thingy that alone by itself has a gross vehicle weight rating of at least 10,001 pounds on its own. Don't include wreckers and things like that. But it also includes a regular pickup truck, just like the one that any of us might be driving down the road. When that pickup truck is attached to a trailer, and on that trailer is enough something where you add all that up and you have a gross combined vehicle weight of over 10,001 pounds. So think in your community about the landscape pickup truck that's hauling one of those wire mesh trailers, but on the trailer, there's 2 or 3 big, huge lawnmowers, maybe the riding lawnmowers or something like that. Think of the plumbing contractor that's just a pickup truck, but he's hauling a trailer that has a ditch witch on it, which is a bit like a bobcat, if you will, if you know what that is, something that somebody might use to tear up your front yard to fix a leak that's in the ground, something that digs. Think of a construction company's pickup truck that's hauling a piece of earth moving equipment behind it. All of those, when you add up the combined vehicle weight ratings and the content of the trailer, you get over the 10,001 pounds. So what does that mean when you get there? What it means is those are commercial motor vehicles. And what it means is that the vast majority of the regulations that govern the big, huge trucks govern those small commercial motor vehicle cases too, drivers also. It means that the drivers of those vehicles have to be qualified in a very similar way. They don't need to have a CDL license, because remember, we're operating under a general provision that doesn't include CDL licensure requirements. But nonetheless, they have to follow the hours of service requirements. They have to be qualified by the companies. They don't have to do drug and alcohol testing. That's one of the exceptions. Why is it an exception? It's an exception because the drug and alcohol policies, the drug and alcohol rules all fall under the part of the regulations that govern CDL drivers. But the parts that have to do with regular qualification, including medical qualification for drivers, falls under the general provisions. So I actually did an article, and Dan, I'll make sure that this gets added to the list. I did an article that sets out exactly what regulations apply to only CDL class vehicles and which ones apply to non-CDL class vehicles. I wrote it a few years ago for AAJ's Trial Magazine, and I'm making a note to include that and send it to Ari so he can include it with the notes. It's a good, handy reference to know what rules apply and what rules don't apply. So let me show you one thing real quick. And by the way, actually, I'm going to grab the screen real quick here. I think I'm doing it right. Hopefully, you can see something that says, "When is a truck a truck?"
We can see that, Joe.
Okay, so this is what I'm saying before, that I'm going to send to Ari so that everybody can get a copy of this PowerPoint. So even like earlier when I talked about the differences, they're all here, different kinds of vehicles, differences in the trucks, so that you can kind of have an idea, a little checklist for yourself to look at for how to differentiate these. When we get into when's a truck, I give you the regulation numbers for the big rig and the smaller commercial motor vehicle. And so this is all, you'll have all this. So if you're trying to keep up with notes, I know it's hard to do. There's a lot of material. This will be at least a good starting point for you. This is how you get to the gross vehicle weight rating, and you add the loaded trailer. So here's where the rule comes in so that you have it right there for you. And so here's the point. By the way, this is a little shortcut of what applies 10,001 pounds and what applies above. But here's the point that I wanted to come to at this point. When you now I'm hoping that some of the 500 or so of you that are on this call, my bet is you didn't know this about trucking before today. So you have in your lineup right now cases that might be trucking cases that you didn't know about. But here to give you a preview of what we talk about later is now you understand that you see this beast here and this picture that you've seen all around town. Sometimes it has Home Depot's name on it, Lowe's name, ABC, delivery company's name, two men in a truck's name, all that kind of stuff. Now you know why there's a whole class of vehicles that weighs 25,950 pounds. Remember the rule, 26,001 pounds. Got to have a CDL license, special licensure, special training, drug tests, alcohol tests, additional rules and regulations. Now, why?
Joe,
now
can I interrupt you real quick?
Sure.
Yeah. So right on this slide, go back to that one slide you just had up with the two. Yeah. So David Milligan asked, well, does the weight, the 10,001 pound, include or exclude their cargo or load?
Okay. So here, interesting. On the 10,001 side, it includes. In the 26,001, it excludes. So when you look back at that slide that I had earlier, gross vehicle weight rating, it says, let's see, I don't think I put that section in here, but it gross vehicle weight or gross combination weight. And if you look at the definition of these things, so gross vehicle weight rating, when they talk about the ratings, it's only the ratings. Literally, you look at the inside door of your driver's door and it'll have a rating from the manufacturer. And that's what you look at for gross vehicle weight rating. But when you get to the 10,001 rule, it also includes gross vehicle weight, which if you look at the definition of that, that also includes the loaded trailer. So that was a cumbersome answer, but the short answer is it includes it. So that's why the pickup truck hauling the wire mesh trailer, between the two of those together, that's probably going to be about 6,000 or 7,000 pounds. But add another 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of equipment onto that trailer, and now you're over 10,001 pounds.
So Joseph Havzepian, if I mispronounced your last name, I apologize. On that question, what if it's a pickup truck towing, for example, a recreational boat? Is that a commercial vehicle? Does it have to be a commercial purpose?
Yeah, so it's got to be a commercial, only commercial purpose, unless you're in the business of hauling boats, in which case you could have a situation where you're a boat store and you're using a pickup truck to haul one, and that's called a drive-away towaway operation, because your cargo is your load, is your load. So in a situation like that, you would have liability. But if it's not a commercial purpose, so this isn't your RV driving down the road. This isn't you pulling a camper. This isn't you, unless you're in the camper business. This isn't you pulling, anything along those lines. It's got to be a commercial purpose. And for you do have to look. I mean, I know we have people from all over the country here. I'm talking right now about the federal motor carrier safety regulations. If you're in intrastate commerce only, intrastate meaning the load only moves within the state, you do have to check your state's regulations. Some of them bump the number up from 10,001 to a little bit higher, 15,000, 14,000 or 16,000 pounds, depending on the state. But many states, most states, they keep the same definitions as the federal regs. So here's the bottom line for your tip. Anytime you're having something that's for a commercial purpose and it's over 10,000 pounds, you need to be thinking, this is a commercial motor vehicle. I need to treat this as a trucking case, not as a regular car wreck case. And I've got to get trucking discovery, and I've got to bump this case out of the normal auto wreck thing, which you'll see when we get to intake, is something that we're recommending.